The topic of today's webinar is Leaders' Spiritual Development based on theory of being-centered leadership, was proposed by Professor Louis Fry and Mark Rieger. I would like to invite Professor Stuart Allen to start his presentation.
Good. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. The goals of the presentation, first of all, are to outline the pathway of leaders' spiritual leader and moral development. And some of that extends on Jodi's presentation earlier this month. And then the second goal is to explore opportunity for leaders and organizations to support spiritual development. And last of all, to summarize some of the challenges of supporting leaders' spiritual development in organizations. So to start off looking at leaders' spiritual leader and moral development, and we were really interested in the parallels between these three forms of development. Before I go into the framework, and Jodi did present it, so I'm going to focus on slightly different perspectives on that framework. I just want to start briefly in talking about a book that was somewhat influential in my thinking around leader spiritual development, and that was William Q. Judge's The Leader's Shadow. And he interviewed and surveyed executive leaders and found that they frequently cited the role of their faith and spirituality in their leadership. And he emphasized that spirituality is often part of an executive leader's character, where you could think of character as being the intersection of personality and values. It determines the way in which people behave, underpinned by a set of values. And he saw spirituality reflecting in the patterns of behaviors of leaders. He also points out that spiritual development involves confronting one's dark side or one's shadow. And there are many aspects to that shadow, including spiritual aspects, but also psychological aspects. And that process then of development involves experiencing pain and darkness as one confronts, as one moves inside and confronts some of the challenging aspects of who one is. One's motives, for example, but also light, which is the joy and the love that comes through healing, through growth, through encountering one's higher power. As is well known in this area of research, spirituality can be related to religion and religious practices, but not always. So some people who engage in spirituality or spiritual practices don't always identify with a particular religion. And then spirituality also brings comfort, strength, and happiness. And those are really just three examples of some of the positive outcomes. And I think if you read Jodi Fry's article from 2003, he elaborates far more on some of those positive outcomes. I'd also mention briefly Gilbert Fairholm's work because it was around the same time, and he was also researching executives' spirituality. One of the interesting things that Judge points to is he looked at the distribution of religious orientations amongst his sample, and he was using Allport's framework of religiosity. And what he found was that roughly 70% of the sample were described as extrinsics, meaning that they are motivated to engage in religion or religious practices by the material benefits of doing that. Religion in some way provides them comfort or belonging. Often he spoke about people being superstitious, and therefore they would engage in religious practices because it would help them feel protected and safe. They did it in case. But it also allowed them to belong and feel connected with the people around them who were religious. He spoke about a second group, which were the intrinsics, who were motivated by their relationship to God or their higher power. That was their motivation for engaging in religion. And one of the questions that I've asked in response to that is, can the same be said of spirituality? Some leaders are certainly motivated to engage in spiritual practices. And I use the example here of mindfulness in the sense that one can use that practice purely just to help calm the mind or to feel more centered or as a way of coping with stress. But it doesn't necessarily always mean that someone would be transformed. And so spirituality can also just be that source of comfort or belonging, or it can go well beyond that. And I think that is reflected in the levels of being on the next slide. But I think this just kind of points to the importance of self-transcendence, where spirituality becomes about more than just oneself and one's own comfort. So this figure is a version that Jody helped, we worked on together to describe the levels of being. And it's a little bit different from the one that he used in his presentation a few weeks ago, and that appears in Krieger and Fry's 2009 article. And what Jody emphasized is that when you look at the levels of being, they're represented sometimes as a hierarchy. But we also know that from looking at spiritual development literature, sometimes those levels are also expressed as stations. It's recognized that it isn't necessarily that some levels are higher than others, but rather the figure represents a journey inside. And it involves both ascent and descent, meaning moving toward level 1, which is the deepest level of spiritual development, and then returning back to a focus more on the sensible, the world that you can see around you, with less of a focus on spirituality. And so when we look at the levels, and I'm really going to summarize them because I know Jody did a far better job of speaking of them. At level 5, the leader is focused on the world around them that they can see, and their emphasis is on creating material success, their own success, achievement, status, money, and their leadership style is based upon that, and their leadership behaviors, which tend toward trying to find ways to perform better, to be a better leader in order to create more material success. The shift then to level 4 is a greater focus on community, in the sense that the leader then is looking at the culture in which they exist, the culture of the organization, for example, and the social construction of that reality. And so they work toward creating and encouraging a vision and values that followers will buy into in order to make the organization more successful. But there's that shift from a focus purely on material success and self to community and the organization as a whole, and success being represented through that vision and values. Level 3 is in my view, one of the most important transitions, because it is where the leader becomes aware of their spiritual self. Often there's an encounter with their higher power or with a spiritual experience that causes them to go inside and to become more conscious of their intuition, their spiritual side, their emotions, as well as their pain. And they begin to introduce spiritual practices into their life, whether that's meditation or prayer or scriptural reading, as ways of continuing that growth. And so leadership, and I didn't mention this for level 4, leadership at level 4 is typically expressed through theories like leader-member exchange, transformational leadership, or charismatic leadership, which is all about creating a vision of the community or the organization, and an emphasis on the organization's success. Whereas that shift into level 3 is often represented in theories like ethical leadership, relational leadership theory, or authentic leadership theory, where the leader aims to be more true to themselves and to their own, what they perceive to be their calling. But they develop an inner life practice, and they start then in moving between levels 3 and level 2 to focus on being more self-transcendent, more focused and aware of others, more focus, especially in level 2, on love and service to others. And I think that Jodium pretty much has a trademark on those terms. But the leadership theories one tends to see represented in level 2 then are servant leadership, spiritual leadership theory, and as well as Ubuntu. And I'm originally from South Africa, so I've had the opportunity to study a bit about Ubuntu, which is very much about being connected to a community and serving that community. Level 1 is not something that one can easily connect to a particular leadership theory. It's in its highest ideals. It includes the highest ideals of spiritual, authentic, servant, and transformational leadership theory, as well as ethical leadership theories. But at this level, the leader looks beyond seeing themselves as part of a specific culture, or a particular race, or a particular nation, or even a particular religion, because they start to see the connection of all things, the connection of the human race to the environment, the connection of all people to each other, and the connection of all things as well to their higher power. And so they look beyond that kind of that dualism. And so that's just a brief summary. What I wanted to add to that, and that now shifts toward the focus on spiritual development, is if we look at, are these levels of being represented in any way, are they supported in any way in the way in which organizations typically focus on leadership development? And it's very clear when one looks at level 5 that most organizations in some way try to train their leaders and managers to be more successful, to perform better. And so often there are certificate courses which feeds the leaders feeling of material success, that you have a certificate saying that you're qualified as a leader, or they focus on material success, which means, selling more, producing more profit. And then as one shifts to what does leadership development typically look like at level 4, in what ways is it supported? I think that certainly leadership training often encourages a focus on the organization's success. If one particularly looks, and I for many years was a trainer who taught transformational leadership approaches using the MLQ, and it is very much about creating a culture that followers can embrace and believe in, and inspiring them toward that. And so many organizations offer that as well. It's sometimes also offered through things like executive coaching, which encourage the leader to focus on the organization's success and building that culture and creating a vision and values. When we start to shift into level 3, because of the focus on the inner self, it's less typically represented in the way organizations focus on leadership development. But certainly some training, some coaching that includes things like self-assessments that make individuals aware of their emotional intelligence, their personality, as well as training that focuses on things like meditation or mindfulness. Again, for many years, I used to train workshops in stress management, and a lot of them focused on being aware of oneself. But typically in organizations, particularly in the West, that isn't that influenced by religion. It's sort of approached more from a psychological perspective, but it does create that same consciousness. Then when we move into level 2, I think that this type of leadership development, it's hard to find examples of conventional leadership development that would focus on this particular level in developing the skills and knowledge that would be typical of this level, because leadership development is expressed through spiritual development and through those inner life practices. Similarly, at level 1, certainly we couldn't think of any particular examples of practices. So at level 2, there is a discourse within executive coaching, which is the soul discourse or the side discourse. And I think in some ways there are executive coaches who would work with their clients, their leader clients, to help them engage their spirituality in deeper ways. And perhaps that touches on level 2. But for the most part, I wouldn't consider that typical. But certainly at level 1, the leader is learning from their wisdom tradition and perhaps even other wisdom traditions. They're learning from their spiritual peers, from mentors, and most definitely from their higher power. They're just through engaging their higher power that they're able to learn lessons and deeper their journey, their spiritual journey. The other thing that we touched on in our article is the issue of moral development. And we saw a parallel here, particularly using Kohlberg and Gilligan's approaches to moral development. And so we can look at how do leaders approach ethical dilemmas, ethical questions. How do they determine what actions to take? And so at level 5, ethical action tends to be more self-serving, very much as one would look at young adults or even children. Their decisions in terms of how to act ethically is really about avoiding punishment or gaining some kind of reward. In other words, they'll act ethically as long as it benefits them. Then the shift into level 4, ethical action, is more conventional. It's about believing in the rules, believing in law and society, and it's not just self-interest, but also interested in collective action. But it is very much about following the rules. That shift into level 3, again, is very important because ethical decisions, ethical action becomes far more intuitive for the leader. And they're looking to balance self and others, but essentially to do the right thing, to look at principles that exist beyond the rules. So although a rule may say that somebody must be terminated for a particular reason, they may look beyond that and consider justice and mercy in that situation. As we move into level 2, and I want to point out again, as Krieger and Fry have mentioned, that typically most leaders do not exist continually or operate continually in level 2 or level 1. They typically move into those levels briefly and then return to level 4 or level 3. When we look at level 2 as a form of spiritual leadership, their ethical action is very much about principles, looking beyond laws and rules to what is right and trying to intuit what that is, which is often, again, based in their inner life practices, is in trying to make decisions. They may spend time in prayer or in solitude or in reading scriptures or sacred texts in order to determine how to handle a particular situation. And then at level 1, at the non-dual level, the leader, as we've expressed, as we understand, has mastered their own emotions, their intuition, has developed a relationship with their higher power, that their wisdom ensures that all their actions are guided by what they understand to be ultimate reality. Meaning, when you look beyond time and current cultures and current thoughts and ideas and see the connection of all things, that is their ultimate reality, and they make decisions within that, moral decisions within that framework. So when we look at spiritual development, and now that I've given a background and connected it a bit to the levels of being, I could talk a little bit about spiritual development, and we embraced Benson's definition, which says that spiritual development is the process of growing the intrinsic human capacity for self-transcendence, in which the self is embedded in something greater than the self, including the sacred. It is the developmental engine that propels the search for connectedness, meaning, purpose, and contribution It is shaped both within and outside of religious traditions, beliefs, and practices. And one of the analogies that we draw upon there is the Sufi analogy of metallurgical purification, which is taking gold or silver and attempting to remove impurities. And so spiritual development, it becomes the purification of the heart, the processes and experiences through which we become more spiritual, become more purified. So some of the practices that we discussed there, the first is spiritual direction. And certainly from our reading, we can see that spiritual direction is evident in all religious traditions. It's typically a dyadic practice, a one-on-one practice where there is a leader and somebody who is wise and experienced in their particular religion or spiritual tradition. And it has those commonalities with coaching, having those one-on-one conversations in which ideas and thoughts and experiences are shared, and both sides listen. And often guidance is shared through encouraging practices or additional readings. It is not conventional in the sense that most organizations would not offer a form of spiritual direction, although what's so interesting is that is beginning to emerge, and you can look at some of David Miller's writings on and research on spiritual chaplains, for example, and certainly we've also seen evidence of some executive coaches using more basic levels of spiritual direction in their practices. But that is particularly relevant then at levels 4 and 3. The other spiritual development practice is the whole set of contemplative practices, and I've given examples there: meditation, journaling, prayer, reading scripture or sacred texts, engaging in music or art, think of worship or praise, solitude, spending time alone. You can think of the Desert Fathers in many traditions there, service, serving others, fasting and self-denial. Those are all examples of contemplative practices that deepen the spiritual journey and foster self-awareness and awareness of one's higher power. They address inner questions, particularly those that have ethical dimensions for leaders. And so often leaders will use them in that way. And those are very critical to that transition, that self-transcendent and deeper spiritual experience evident at levels 3 and level 2. Jody did speak briefly about discernment, so I'll just touch on it then, is that discernment is a practice of trying to make a decision about what the right thing to do is, whether that's an ethical decision or a decision around what to do with one's life or whether to accept a job as a leader. All of those things would be examples. It's a very introspective practice and can be facilitated through studying sacred text, through meditation, through prayer. It can also be done collectively. In other words, working with maybe one spiritual director or working with one spiritual community to talk about the underpinning issues and to figure out what the best decision is. And the last that we speak about in the article is spiritual crises. Now within the Christian tradition, that's sometimes called the Dark Nights, but again, the spiritual crises are evident in all religions. And it's not a practice as the others are, which are practices that one can choose to engage in, because it's something that is involuntarily imposed on you. And so often an individual experiences that the spiritual practices that they used to engage in no longer work. They no longer feel that connection to their higher power. They're feeling unsatisfied with their spiritual life. So there's that frustration, that disconnection. And that spiritual crisis can last weeks, months, long periods of time. But through that dryness and through overcoming dependence on previous spiritual practices, overcoming dependence on their senses, which might include, maybe they've been experiencing material success through their leadership, or they've been relying too much on rational thought. All of those things, they are able to overcome more of them and move deeper into their spirit and become more in tune with their higher power through that spiritual crisis. And there are people often experience multiple spiritual crises. Hardship can also bring about forms of spiritual crisis in terms of illness or trauma. So I think we could recognize through what I have mentioned so far that there is a spiritual path that leaders can travel, and that there are practices that they can engage in order to move along that path. But one of my areas of interest has been how do we view this in the organizational context? Is this something that organizations should encourage? Is this something that organizations should facilitate? And I think that if one looks at those books that are written about the spiritual development of leaders, and I'm thinking particularly of a book written by Margaret Benefield, where she interviewed a number of leaders, and many of them had spiritual directors. They went through spiritual crises. They engaged in discernment practices, but it was largely individually driven. It was part of their own spiritual life. It wasn't always something that the organization actually encouraged or facilitated unless it was a faith-based organization. But as we're seeing, there is this transition towards organizations becoming more involved in spirituality in the workplace and encouraging spiritual development. And so one way in which this is expressed is through executive coaching. And this was an article that Jody and I wrote in 2019 in the Journal of Management Development. And we recognized an opportunity that executive coaching could address spiritual topics. And we defined spiritual development through executive coaching as consensual interaction around spiritual topics and practices for the purpose of facilitating growth in the client's understanding and awareness of their spiritual self as a leader and whole person, and enhancing the client's spiritual inner life practice with the goal of enhancing the client's spiritual fulfillment and effectiveness as a leader. So we saw opportunities in which an executive coach could do that, and I have been involved in executive coaching. It's very natural that spiritual themes or spiritual topics tend to come up because you are not just helping a person develop a set of skills, but exploring who they are and how they react to situations, their emotions, their inner self, and often they will express frustrations around the results they're achieving, where their career is going, concerns about moral issues. And some of them will be very overt and talk directly about their religious or spiritual beliefs. I think in other cases, there are opportunities for executive leaders, executive coaches, to do a basic spiritual assessment with their clients, is to just ask questions about whether they feel they are spiritually or they got engaged in spiritual practices. Is that important to them? Even just as a reflective practice, not necessarily as something that's directional where you're trying to push them in a particular direction. But also in helping the person become more effective, they might need to learn some basic meditation or mindfulness practices, or be able to recognize spiritual issues. And so at those early stages of someone, particularly who is in level 3 and is awakening to that inner spiritual life, an executive coach may be the first person that the leader encounters. Often they may not have opportunities because they spend many hours at work, maybe don't have other people to talk with about those issues. And so we saw that there was an opportunity there. But we also emphasize that referral may often be appropriate because often as a person goes deeper into their spiritual life, it goes beyond what the executive coach knows, beyond the executive coach's own spiritual maturity or it may be in a different religion or spiritual practice. And it certainly becomes more productive to encourage a person then to find a spiritual director or to engage with their spiritual community. I think one of the challenges that comes up in this context, particularly, is confidentiality. Sometimes executive coaching sessions are not considered strictly confidential, and there may also be conflicts of interest because if the client organization is paying, their emphasis is on increasing performance, not necessarily spiritual development, despite the fact we know that their spiritual development may ultimately contribute to being a more effective leader. Spiritual topics may also sometimes come up in training that organizations offer, particularly when workshops are offered on topics like emotional intelligence, meditation, mindfulness, developing moral intuition, stress management, sensitivity and self-awareness training. I think that there are limits to how spiritual those things tend to become, particularly in the Western world, because we're in a pluralistic environment. And so there are many religions sometimes in the workplace, and one needs to be cautious about offending people by focusing on any one particular religious or spiritual tradition. But I think Andre Delbecq demonstrated very clearly in his work with his MBA students that he was able to engage many different religious and spiritual traditions within his classes to achieve these kinds of goals. Last of all, I'd mention that there are opportunities for organizations to try to normalize engaging in spiritual development, or leaders engaging in spiritual development. Some of the ways in which that can be done is providing time and spaces. In other words, some organizations create gardens or prayer spaces, create workshops or opportunities that allow people to engage in spiritual aspects of their life, including through volunteering and service. So those are just examples of opportunities, but also an examination of policies that support pluralism and the safe expression of faith and spirituality. And I think that Miller and Ewist's article on the different ways in which organizations approach faith in the workplace is particularly useful here. They talk about organizations that are more secular, those that are faith-based, those that are faith-safe, and those that are faith-friendly, and the way in which policies can create an environment where people feel comfortable expressing aspects of their spirituality and engaging aspects of their spirituality in the workplace. I think also the examples of the leaders and the way in which they respond to their own spiritual lives and the ways in which they share that can also normalize practices. I think the triple bottom line is also very important here, because by focusing on the triple bottom line, organizations are expressing that more than just profit matters, that our connection to society, that our connection to the environment, the connection to all things is important. And to me, that is spiritual. And then last of all, the availability of training, coaching, chaplains, and the ways in which they're able to address these topics. My last section is just briefly to talk about some of the challenges, and I think I've mentioned some of them already, is that if we're going to look at trying to encourage leaders to engage in spiritual development, some of the challenges we encounter are issues of privacy, that some people don't want to share their spiritual lives, or they don't believe that the organization needs to know about that. And I can certainly understand that, agree that I am a private person. I understand that. And it depends on the degree to which the organization feels safe that one would want to engage in those issues. There are also often conflicts of interest. The organization might have a situation with someone who, for example, is not performing, but is engaging in a difficult part of their life spiritually. And so, those create a conflict for the organization. Is do we be understanding of that, or do we emphasize performance? There are also challenges around people who are in a place in their religious or spiritual lives where they may be discriminated against other people, or they aim to proselytize or indoctrinate others in a way that is harmful to the organization. That creates a challenge, again, conflict of interest for the organization. In terms of investing in those individuals' spiritual development. Certainly there needs to be consent, that people need to be aware. And to me, this is a concern that I've seen in organizations, situations where organizations present spiritual materials, spiritual content under the guise of other topics. And it really is, for example, taught from a particular religious perspective. So last of all, I've mentioned recognizing the boundaries of religious and spiritual authority, that one needs to respect that the clerics and the wise people within people's religious traditions are more knowledgeable than any organization, and it's an area that they must be careful to walk into or to engage in. It also depends a lot on the competence and spiritual maturity of HR managers, coaches, and trainers. And I wrote an article in 2018 on the spiritual competencies, or the competencies of HR managers to encourage workplace spirituality. And then last of all, depending, and I touched on this as well, is one dealing with an organization that is more pluralistic with multiple religious and spiritual traditions, or one that is faith-based specifically. So I hope that was interesting and useful. I look forward to your questions, and I'm glad that Jody is here as well. He may also have some wisdom on some of the questions. Thank you so much.
Well, the main thing I would say is that Stuart knows more about this than I do, really. I mean, he brought the leadership development aspect to our papers, and really enriched my view of of how the levels of being play out, and especially in terms of the leader development. And so I believe our two presentations are very, very complementary in that regard. I really don't have much to add to this presentation. It's an awesome job, Stuart.
Thank you, Judy. I have a question, and after my question, I can turn to other participants' questions. I'm thinking about the method you use to explore some details about each level of beings. You describe some specific characteristics of each level of being, and but I don't know based on which method you explore these details. I mean, for example, I can guess that you maybe conduct some interviews with some spiritual masters, or maybe you did a content analysis of some religious textbooks. Could you please explain about the method you used?
Thank you for that question. I want to be honest in saying that much of certainly the framework was based upon Fry Krieger's work, where they examined 5 different religious traditions in determining those levels. I think that what we focused on in this particular case was then starting to look at parallels between those levels of being, and what was shown in the levels of leadership development. And there are not that many models that divide leadership development into sets of progressive levels. I think particularly of some of Sharan's work, for example, the leadership pipeline, where they sort of speak, for example, about particular levels. And so we tried to identify all the literature that looked at leadership development, and some of it looked at it more as a process, and some of it looked at it more as in terms of the series of levels. and we then tried to look at how that compared with the levels of being. I wouldn't say that in significant ways that we elaborated upon the levels of being within these particular recent works. Although I would say in writing the articles and thinking about this, we tried to visit authors' works around spirituality and management from many different traditions. And as you know, Jody, for example, has co-written articles around spirituality and leader spirituality in the Islamic tradition. And so we pulled on as much literature as we were able to find and to look at parallels in moral development, particularly looking at Kohlberg and Gilligan's work, but there were others that we looked at as well. So I would say, for the most part, it was deeply focused on looking at literature, not just academic literature, but also spiritual literature. But I think that you point to an important need, and that is to continue to validate the levels through interviews and through possibly engaging experts around those levels and seeing how they can be clarified and improved upon.
Thank you, Professor. I'm thinking about it would be great if we can find some spiritual masters who touch the absolute reality and who access to level 1 or 2, and we find them and we conduct some interviews with them, but it is really hard to find them because this topic is more experiencing knowledge. Do you agree?
I think that the idea of finding leaders who have exhibited levels 2 and level 1 would certainly be very, very challenging, and very challenging to gain access to such leaders, because even as Jody and I thought about trying to include examples, for the most part, level 1 is exemplified through the prophets of the major religions, but not through many living people. Some people would refer to Nelson Mandela maybe as an example of someone who exhibited level 1 at times within their leadership. And we, in fact, got challenged by a particular reviewer in writing the article where we mentioned, I think, Martin Luther King, because they pointed out some of the things that he had done which weren't evident of that. No, in fact, sorry, I apologize. It was Martin Luther King. I think it might have been Gandhi. But it's interesting because you will get into a debate and people will challenge you on whether a particular leader truly exemplifies level 1. I think perhaps at level 2, one might find that some of the most the spiritual masters in different traditions, certainly one could either interview them or look at biographies or autobiographies as a way of accessing that information. But I think that we do mention in the article that in some ways those things are theoretical because of the difficulties of researching those levels. If it helps while we wait for Vickers to come on, Jody, I wondered if you, I can see your mic is on. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how one goes about researching and validating the levels or gaining a deeper understanding. Do you have any insights on that?
Well, I've been thinking about this a long time. I mean, over 10 years. And, there's a couple of things. One is that, it's real easy to think of these as the levels as steps. And we've reached a certain level, and there we are. And you mentioned that, that you alluded to this briefly. But really what the spiritual practice allows us to do is operate at higher levels more consistently, because we can fall across multiple levels in a day. You know, I can pull out in traffic and somebody pulls in front of me and I'm not very spiritual at that moment, you know. And maybe in the past, you know, I might have had a little road rage. And so, you know, it would linger. It would linger. But the thing about it is if we're operating at these higher levels more consistently, we have the tools when we drop to the lower levels to then become aware of our negative emotions or sensations or whatever they are, and then not let them overtake us, or we can release those and then move back to those higher levels. So I really tend to think of levels 3 and 4, I mean, levels 5 and 4 and levels 3 and 2 is more of the distinct reality of where we may be able to approach in reality. Because I think we are able to be more present on a consistent basis. And I think there are a lot of people that are more and more now, I think, you know, especially in the West, people are, you know, mindfulness is accepted. You know, now, of course, oftentimes it's for instrumental reasons, not for the employee's spiritual growth, but whether they think it's instrumental or not, the employee will probably have some spiritual growth if they stay at it. It might even realize how exploitive the organization is and leave it because of the practice. So, I think that might be a more fruitful way to begin research in this area, rather than trying to look for those pinnacles pinnacle examples of the higher levels, and then maybe out of the results of that, we might be able to get more fine-grained in our research.
Hello, Vikas.
Hi.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah,
Could you
same here.
please introduce yourself?
Right. I'm Professor Vikas Bhatnagar from India. I just had, this was a very interesting session. The level 5s are extremely fascinating. And I think the measurement is what is a challenge. And once this framework has been developed, I think the other scholars would definitely start thinking on how to have the right measurements. I just had two observations, which I just mentioned in the comment section. One was Ken Wilber has done a lot of work in terms of the consciousness, the different levels. And then David Hawkins, through his method of kinesiology in the book Power versus Force, he has measured consciousness, right? So the challenge would be there might be people who may say that they are masters, but we do not know what is inside them, right? So how do we ascertain that the masters are really masters in terms of their level of consciousness? So that is where maybe the method of kinesiology can be useful, right? I just had that thought. The session has triggered my thinking quite a lot. Thank you so much.
Interesting, very interesting. I think that also as leadership research moves more into sort of neuro leadership and the use of active brain scanning or I think it's EMRI. There's certainly been some work that is related to Kelvin Wilber. I'd also think of Bill Torbert's work, and certainly I know that some of that was influential in Jody and in Brian Krieger's construction of their of the levels, is that they did consider those. I think that we've also tried where we can to look for those parallels within the different religious traditions. But I hear what you're saying. There is that challenge around validating it. Certainly, one can try to look for external evidence. It would be very fascinating, I think, to engage some leaders who, throughout their lives, have maybe demonstrated level 3 and level 2. I was thinking recently of Steve Jobs and his late life, and when he passed of cancer, and one, we know that he was a Buddhist, and that he focused on those things, and certainly there is a great deal of record keeping and biographies written about that, and so one could look for some of those living examples, and interview and explore. But I think validating it and finding ways to measure is a very interesting topic.
You provide 4 ways to spiritual development. The first one is spiritual direction. The second one is contemplative practices. The third one is discernment. And the last one is spiritual crisis. It seems that the third one is the consequence of 2 previous ones. Do you agree?
I think that all 4, in fact, are highly related in the sense that when you engage in discernment, certainly you need to develop having mastered some level of contemplative practice is critical to discernment, because discernment is all about going inside and trying to understand what your intuition, what your spirit, what your higher power is expressing to you. And without those contemplative practices, you're stuck in this sensual world, this material existence. And so it is critical that contemplative practices must be mastered to engage in some level of discernment. And I think it is very difficult to develop a skillful use of contemplative practice without having a spiritual director or a spiritual master, or someone who is more knowledgeable and experienced that you can learn from. Certainly, there's a great deal that one can read about these things, but you can still mislead yourself. And that tends to be the power of a spiritual director, is being able to speak from their own experience and knowledge of having traveled that journey, and having experienced self-deception and hopelessness and all of the things that go along with the spiritual journey. And so in attempting to discern and to make a decision to discern, for example, one's calling, I do believe that I very much agree with you that having a spiritual director and having real experience, meaningful experience with contemplative practices is important. However, they all feed each other. I think they're all connected in that way. And what's interesting then is that spiritual crises can often can initiate one's spiritual development, this whole start of this process through which one seeks out a spiritual director and gets engaged in contemplative practices and begins to discern, what is the meaning of my leadership? What is the meaning of my life? What do I want to do with my life? So all of those things then are very connected in my view. I think that we were influenced to some degree by Andre Delbec's work in this area, and also searching different spiritual literature to see if we could find other spiritual practices. But I think there are some opportunities to keep thinking about these 4 and whether they are the only 4, or whether there are further processes and practices that are critical to lead a spiritual development.
Thank you. I agree with you that all of 4 ways to development of spirituality is really important, and they are interconnected. But if you want to choose one of them, the most important one, which one you choose?
I think that for me, and I'm hoping Jody would agree too, is that I think contemplative practices is the bedrock in all respects, because that is how one cultivates an inner life, is through prayer and through scripture. As I mentioned just now, even if one doesn't have a spiritual director, often through reading scripture or sacred text, one can learn how to experience a deeper spirituality, to how to reach out to or connect with one's higher power in deeper ways. And one can also use those practices and one's connection with one's higher power to discern. So from that point of view, I would say contemplative practices is far more foundational.
I'm thinking about imagine someone who experience spiritual crisis maybe disagree with you. I want to ask Judy Fry about this question. Do you have any idea about this question, Judy?
Would you repeat it? I just caught part of it. I'm sorry. Would you repeat your question? I'm sure I have an idea. I got ideas about just anything, just about everything. So, sure.
You provide 4 ways to develop spirituality. The first one is spiritual direction and others. If you want to choose the most important one, which one you can use? You can choose.
Well, I agree. I can't imagine we disagree as much as we work together. Any practice that allows us to be more present, to be that I talked about to be the watcher, so that we can, because we can only, we can argue about this, but I think it's clear in the religious traditions. One can only experience God in the now, in the present. For example, when Moses was on the mountain, he says, "Who are you?" to God. And God says, "I am that I am." Well, that means I'm here now in the present. And so and I mentioned this last time too, that practice is the gateway to peace, the gateway to the ultimate experiences that we as humans may briefly glimpse, but we'll never be in that place, in that non-dual space, or in God totally, in this world. And so if you don't have the key to the gate, you can't get into the promised land. And so that's I feel very strongly about that. And of course, I have been commissioned as a spiritual director, and have some experience. I'm not, it's not my livelihood by any means, but I do have directees, and I have a spiritual director. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I didn't mention either is the importance of of course, a spiritual community, but also, and this is missing, especially in the Christian tradition. This is my experience of it in the public religious services, is the real importance of what are called spiritual friends. Those people who they're called accountability groups sometimes, but having a small group. For example, in Christianity, Jesus had his 3, Peter, James, and John, and they went up on the mount with him, and saw saw the prophets. So it's important to have those that are also on a spiritual journey, that know me very well, that can then share that experience in their grief, and that we can openly and honestly and be vulnerable. And because they're friends, we see them fairly regularly. So I would add that to what we also talked about in our papers.
I would add. would add to what you were saying there, Jody, and it's a study that I have not seen done yet, but would really interest me is looking back at historical figures. I think in mythology and certainly certainly in Western movies, one often sees famous leaders as having counselors or advisors, and some of those would be from particular religious or spiritual traditions that would provide that guidance. And I think that leaders often do have those, either spiritual friends or wise counselors that they draw upon. But I've not really seen anybody do an analysis of that. Certainly, I'm not someone who's an expert in history, and somebody who was might look at that is go back and look at some famous figures that have well-documented lives, and to look at the role of their spiritual friends or their spiritual advisors in that way. But just in reacting to what you were saying and bringing this to the organizational context, it is very interesting to me that it is perhaps easier for organizations if they wish to encourage spirituality to create opportunities for contemplative practices much more than focusing on discernment or spiritual crises or spiritual direction, because organizations are doing this through offering prayer rooms or offering gardens that people can go and walk in, through including art in the workplace, through creating exposure to nature. All of those things in some way help people create opportunities for them to engage mindfulness training as well in the spiritual aspects of their lives.
Thank you. I think in the level 4 and level 3, when someone try to start this journey, the first one, spiritual direction, is more important than others. It is my opinion. And at the end of the journey, the last one, spiritual crisis, is more important than others. Alexander, do you ready to start your talk? Hi, nice to see you. I don't have your voice. Please click on the icon which is located.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful presentation. And thank you, Professor Allen and Professor Fry. I was reading your work earlier, but this was so much more illuminating and useful. What I'd like to comment on, earlier there was a question about whether or not we should conduct interviews with some of the leaders. And that reminded me that a former doctoral student of mine conducted a study, and he is actually finishing a book based on that, where he interviewed 20 leaders of business, nonprofit, and religious organizations. And many of them can be classified as people at level 3 or even level 2 in your model. And so he found actually things which are quite similar to some of the stages you are describing and some of the practices. Definitely, most of them talked about going through the dark night of the soul or through this challenge and crisis. And other elements are also similar to that. So it struck me that this really, there is some, maybe small scale, some limited, but studies that validates what you are discussing.
Well, thank you. And at some point when the student is published, keep me updated. I'd be interested in seeing that. I certainly think that some of the examples I mentioned, like where I started with Judge's work in the Leader's Shadow and some of Gilbert Fairholm's work, they had conducted interviews with leaders, and certainly created a foundation in these areas. I think the other one is Margaret Benefield. She is her one book is focused on, I think, 5 leaders and their whole spiritual journey. So I think that certainly there is a growing body of evidence that one can look at, and we've attempted as best as we can to look at that as ways to validate the levels and our approach. And I'm glad to hear that there is more happening under your guidance.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Alexander. It was Professor Alexander Ardichvili from University of Minnesota. I have another question. As I said, I have some discussions with Iranian scholars who are experienced in Islamic mysticism. Some of the questions, I got these questions from them. And for example, this question: if I were you, I would emphasize on the will of God more than you did. For example, in some part of your article, you mentioned that other-oriented values. If I were you, I replace it with God-oriented values. What do you think?
I think that the way in which we approach this, and I remember a stage where Jody and I were describing in the article, what we meant by higher power, and we did try to approach this in an inclusive way, recognizing that that readers might be from monotheistic religions, they may be from polytheistic religions, they may also be, if one looks at the US and other populations, certainly there's a growing secular population, and yet people within that group would still call themselves spiritual. And even we found examples of them seeking out spiritual directors. And so, we're trying to reconcile writing for an audience that there are different religions. But I would certainly understand if we were talking about Islam and Christianity and Judaism, it would make great sense to emphasize God specifically within that language. So I understand very clearly. I think that spiritual development path, represented through the levels as well as the actual practices themselves, the language that we would use if we were writing to those religions would look quite different. And so it's that reconciliation. If one looks at Buddhism and some of the other religions that are also being discussed in this space, they tend to take a slightly different approach. And we were trying to see if there were commonalities across those religions and across and being inclusive of secular traditions as well. I certainly agree with you, but it would depend on the audience that you were writing to. I think it's an interesting issue as well, specifically for me in talking with someone from Iran, because certainly in writing to a Western audience, we have to be very conscious of that pluralism, and it's certainly growing within the US, and I don't know that I have a strong understanding of whether that is true in Iran, because I think if you're in a workplace where most people share the same belief, how one approaches spiritual development might be quite different than if you're dealing with a very pluralistic environment where the leader might be accused of discrimination if they promote just Christian prayer, or if they focus a lot on Buddhist meditation, where in more homogenous cultures that might be different.
Yeah, I can understand your situation in United States of America, but I mean, the goal is the God or ultimate reality or higher power.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is not people. People
Mm-hmm.
act as a mean, as an
Mm-hmm.
instrument to reach the satisfaction of God or satisfaction of ultimate reality.
Yes. Yes.
I mean,
I would agree. I would agree with you on that point. I think that the emphasis that we put on others is very essential to levels 4 and 3, because here we're having a leader who moves beyond self and begins to be more aware of others and begins to be more aware of community. And I think that within the Christian tradition and many other traditions, there's a parallel process of becoming more aware of others that goes along with the deepening relationship with God, because as you deepen your relationship with God, you want to serve. God uses you as an instrument to serve his will in that way. And so I agree with you that in those traditions, the focus is not on other people, but on God more correctly, especially as you move into levels 2 and 1.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It seems that Judy wants to talk. Judy raised his hand.
Yeah, well, as an only child, I always want to talk. You know, you had a professor on top of that, and it's hard to, like gas in a jar, I expand to fit my container. And so I'm not trying to, I think for this work, I think it's important to put this in context of spiritual leadership and the spiritual leadership model. And the original intent when we published the first piece on spiritual leadership theory in 2003. And that was to look at the foundational spirituality that underlies all the world's religious traditions. And that is going inward to find a source of strength greater than ourselves, which I choose to call God, personally. So that we can experience a sense of self-transcendence and interconnectedness as one with all. And of course, that is the non-dual. The non-dual or God is everything and is nothing. It encompasses everything and nothing. And from that place, then, to go forward to pursue a vision of loving and serving others, grounded in the values, grounded in love, loving and serving others. And I believe that is fundamental. I guess we could have a conversation about that, but fundamental to the world's religions. And so when Ella Eagle and I developed the piece on spiritual leadership as a model for Islamic leadership development, we mapped the components of the spiritual leadership model into the Islamic sacred texts. I mean, that was the purpose. And as a matter of fact, I'm now working, in fact, we're under revise and resubmit for the Journal of Business Ethics. I've got a Buddhist scholar who's also, at a university. She's Vietnamese. She's at a university in the UK. And what we've done is use the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Of course, I'm not a Buddhist, so I'm no expert in this. The Eightfold Path as a means to move through the levels of being towards the Buddhist conception of non-self. And so here it is focused on Buddhism. And so I don't think we're at odds with your Islamic scholar at all. But also we are on earth. And we do have to deal in secular organizations. And I think all the issues or points that Stuart made are valid. But there's also organizations that aren't business focused. And we live in an organizational world. And so we can certainly discern our own God's will and practice that in our lives, whether we do that overtly or not. So I can be in a secular organization and pursue what I believe is God's will and influence others towards that whatever is I believe should be manifested in the world without ever declaring it. And so I think that's where it really manifests or plays out.
Thank you, Judy.
I could see that Vickers was responding to a question just before that, which was asking about what is the relationship between the leader and the follower at the non-dual level. And I think that based on what Jody just emphasized, I think is that at the non-dual level, the leader experiences, sees the connection of all things and the unification of all things. And so from that point of view, the leader doesn't see, doesn't respond to the follower as being different from themselves, but rather sees that commonality, that oneness with all other people, and responds in that way as in love, which is certainly in the Christian tradition, the emphasis is on to love God and to love others as one loves oneself, and so love is expressed toward all other things, to all other people, and so one would treat others as as if they were oneself. So I hope that makes sense. That's the best way I could see to respond. And I think that was what Vickers was saying as well.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you so much. The time is over. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Alexander. And thank you, Vikas, for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. I hope after political challenges, one day we can see all of you in Iran. Thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for arranging this and for the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's been an incredible experience.
Thank you, Judy. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.